behind the scenes recording of the Self-Employed Life podcast. You're in for a real treat today. Do you know how sometimes you meet someone at just the right time, or someone says something exactly when you need to hear it, or maybe you meet the love of your life and realize it was meant to be all along? What's really behind those serendipitous moments? You're about to find out with my guest, Dr. Christian Busch. Christian is the best-selling author of Connect the Dots, the art and science of creating good luck, which has been highlighted as a wise, exciting, and life-changing book by Arianna Huffington. He is a visiting fellow at LSE and the director of the CGA Global Economy Program at New York University, where he teaches purpose-driven leadership, entrepreneurship, emerging markets, and social innovation. He is the co-founder of Sandbox Network, a global community of young innovators, as well as leaders on purpose, an organization convening leading CEOs. Christian is among Diplomatic Courier's top 99 influencers, JCI's 10 outstanding persons, and on the Thinkers 50 radar list of 30 management thinkers. He is also a member of the World Economic Forum's Expert Forum and a fellow of the Royal Society of Arts. That is quite the portfolio. So welcome, Christian. Glad to have you here.
Thank you so much for having me.
I have to say, one of the things that so resonated for me about your work is I think we share a philosophy that while we can't control much of the circumstances of life, we can control the environment we create for the results we want. Is that largely what you're saying in your book, that we have more control than we might initially think around these ideas of good luck and serendipity?
Absolutely. And it's really, usually when we think about kind of luck, we think about it as something that's passive, right? That just happens to us, to your point. I mean, being born into a nice family, things like this, we can't really do a lot about this. But actually, serendipity, when you really look back at the most interesting examples in history, it's always smart luck. There's always this kind of unexpected moment or something that we cannot control, but then it's our reaction to it that turns it into something meaningful, that makes it something meaningful. And so, take the example, if you have erratic hand movements like I do, you spill a lot of coffee. And so, imagine you spill coffee over someone in a coffee shop and they look at you annoyedly, but also you sense there might be something there. Now you have two options, right? Option number one is you just say, I'm so sorry, you walk outside and you think, what could have happened had I spoken with the person? Option number two, you speak with the person, that person, to your point, becomes the love of your life, your co-founder, you name it. So it's our reaction to that unexpected moment, how we make the accident meaningful, that really kind of turns it out. And as we can talk about, it's both the kind of making the accident meaningful, but also we can create more meaningful accidents.
Yeah, I love what you do. You describe it in the book as a synthesis between pure chance and human effort. I love that because, again, I think that just encapsulates when I raised my kids with this principle: you have to meet the sun halfway. I like the idea, like we should live our lives in a way that we believe in good fortune. We believe the sun is shining on us. We want to stay optimistic, but we can't be lazy about it. We have to meet the sun halfway, and I kind of see these moments of serendipity like that. You know, One of the things, and you actually kind of alluded to it, that struck me interesting is that in your research, you found that there's a way of thinking, what you refer to as a serendipity mindset. One could even say there's kind of a type of person that's more likely to see serendipitous moments in their life. So tell us about that person. Maybe we can do a reality check to see if we are that person, right? What are some of the mindsets and characteristics that are common of someone who's more likely to see serendipity in their life?
That's a great question. And if you look at it as a kind of Venn diagram type where you have all these different circles and then they come together to form a serendipity mindset in their overlaps, one of the most important ones is around that idea of alertness and actually believing that something might be there, not in the kind of voodoo type sense in terms of, good things come to you, but more in the sense of if we put our mind to something, it's more likely that we spot unexpectedly positive moments. And so there's a lot of experiments that are about this idea of the way we frame the world in a way then makes it far more likely that we have more luck. And so to give you one example experiment that I'm a big fan of, it's essentially, and I'd love to ask viewers, if you consider yourself to be lucky or unlucky, and really kind of that then will actually also have a huge impact of how much luck you will have in the future. And the reason is because you will look differently at the world. And so in this one experiment, they took people who self-identify as very lucky, so people who say good things tend to happen to me and so on, and then people who self-identify as very unlucky, so people who say bad things tend to happen to me, I'm always in accidents and so on. And they pick one of each, and then they say walk down the street, go into a coffee shop, grab a coffee, sit down, and then we'll have our conversation, our interview. What they don't tell them is that there's hidden cameras along the street and inside the coffee shop. There's a £5 note, so money, in front of the coffee shop. And inside the coffee shop, there's this one empty table next to this extremely successful businessman who can make big dreams happen. Now, the lucky person walks down the street, sees the £5 note, picks it up, goes inside the shop, sits next to the businessman, orders the coffee, has a conversation with the businessman, they exchange business cards, potentially an opportunity coming out of it. We don't know that part. Now, the unlucky person walks down the street, steps over the £5 note, so doesn't see it, goes inside the shop, orders the coffee, sits next to the businessman, ignores the businessman, and that's it. Now, at the end of the day, they ask both people, how was your day today? And so the lucky person says, it was amazing. I found money in the street, made a new friend, and potentially an opportunity coming out of it. The unlucky person just says, well, nothing really happened. And it's really this, we probably all know people in our lives, right, where you can put them into exactly the same situation, but one seems to just be a little bit luckier than others. There's a lot of factors to this, right? The one in this experiment is really more about the alertness, but I'm a big fan of the idea that, yes, some people more intuitively do that, right? Some people like you intuitively, once you look out for money in the street, you find it more often, right? It's just because you put your mind to it. I find a lot of money in the street, unfortunately, mostly pennies, so it doesn't really help me. But once you look out for it, it happens. So there's a lot of factors that we can control, and I think that's the key behind that mindset, is to say we can build a muscle for the unexpected that has those different elements: alertness, curiosity, and so on. We can talk more about the other factors, but I'm a big fan of really training ourselves step by step. Take one different street to work in the morning and be open to looking into the bookstore and seeing this old book and thinking, oh my God, this could be a podcast. Things like this, where we can learn to connect the dots differently.
Yeah, I think one of the big takeaways from the book is this idea of a mindset of the unexpected. Here's what I think is really interesting about that right now, is because there's also in business a huge emphasis on making best use of our time. The danger of that is I think a lot of people are putting themselves in an opportunity, being so conscious of their time and where they're putting their attention, that I think it's worth asking ourselves, are we limiting the opportunities for serendipity because we're not putting ourselves in situations of the unexpected for fear that the unexpected meeting or just having lunch with somebody casually is starting to feel more like a time suck. And maybe what we've lost is a little bit of the mindset of, hey, who knows what can happen? Maybe it's unexpected. I just know from having read your book, I can literally say that I have been more open to chance meetings and maybe giving a little bit more of my time where maybe I would have been a little more protective. So I think there's a very interesting connection there, I think, between the protection of ourselves and whether we're leaving ourselves open to serendipity. You also give a lot of examples in the book, and certainly in the medical field, it's probably the best place to see this, that there has been a lot of mistakes, particularly in the medical field, have led to serendipitous moments and really great medical findings. So what's the difference then, do you think, between something being a good accident? Maybe you can give by example, because you give a lot in the book of medical inventions that have saved lives, but that were accidents. What's the difference between something just being a good accident and actually it feeling like serendipity?
Yeah, that's a great question. And also, Jeffrey, to your earlier point, I think, we're all in fight or flight at the moment, right? We just had a collective near-death experience where, everyone's like, oh my God, like, most of our assumptions have been questioned. We're all under pressure to perform in some way or the other, or to find some kind of new meaning. And so I think it's only kind of very natural that a lot of us might be a bit more close to potential serendipity, because we're so focused on just literally survival, right? But that's also what I'm fascinated by in terms of when you look at extreme contexts, like the poverty context where a lot of our work is based, that out of necessity, a lot of serendipity then emerges, right? So the Pfizer vaccine, right, that kind of like a German company, biotech, was working on something related to RNA technology that could help cure cancer, and then unexpectedly so they connected the dots and developed that vaccine for it. Those things come out of necessity, and so I'm also a big believer that no matter how stressed we are, and if we see serendipity just as the kind of nice to have, then yes, then it's kind of something where we will kind of cut down the potential meetings we could have with people and so on. But also I feel like at any given point we can train ourselves to try to see something in every moment. So in every moment that goes wrong, especially, I found it extremely useful to always think about, is there something still in here that could be meaningful? And the reason I'm saying this, and Jeffrey, maybe this becomes too philosophical, but please stop me in my tracks then. But
Nothing's ever too philosophical for me.
But I've always been a huge fan of Viktor Frankl, and
Mm-hmm.
Viktor Frankl, he survived the Holocaust. He was in a concentration camp, and he always wondered, how did I, Viktor, psychologically survive this? How did I keep hope? Because it's a meaningless situation to be in a concentration camp from any definition that we could use. And he created meaning. He said, you know what, I'm in here, and there's no objective meaning here, but I will create a subjective meaning where every day now I want to speak with another fellow prisoner and make them feel better about themselves. And by doing this now, I have a reason to wake up tomorrow morning. It gives me meaning too. And so I'm a big fan of really saying, in every given situation, is there something in here, in a breakup that feels emotionally so tough? Well, but you know what? Maybe that's the door we have to close now, because it then kind of allows us to open the door to the real love of our life. And if that door wouldn't have closed, we couldn't have opened the other one. And so it's really those things where I've become a big fan of this idea that, look, if you want a happy ending, you can't stop the story too early. And serendipity has a long incubation time a lot of times. It might be a crisis in the moment that feels really bad, right? Like a bankruptcy of a company, or a breakup. But actually that becomes the inflection point a lot of times to something much bigger, much more interesting, and much more beautiful. And I think that's a lot of times, Jeffrey, to your second question, in terms of, when you think about medical inventions and innovations, think about everything from penicillin to other things. There's always some kind of mistake, something going wrong. But then the researchers saying, you know what, maybe there's something in here that could be helpful. And my favorite example there actually is one, I don't know if it saves life. Probably indirectly, it saved quite a few lives, which is, a couple of decades ago, some researchers were giving people medication against angina pectoris, the disease, and they realized in male participants' trousers there was some kind of movement happening. And what would we usually do? We'd probably say, oh my God, this is embarrassing. Like, let's somehow kind of like ignore this, or find a better way to cure angina without this kind of side effect, right? They did the opposite. They said, you know what, that's unexpected, but there's probably a lot of men in the world who might have a problem in that department. So why don't we develop a medication around this? And that's how unexpectedly so Viagra became one of the best-selling medications.
I had no idea until I read it in your book that Viagra was for many people, a very happy accident. So it's a great example of just, seeing the opportunity and everything. And I want to give our listeners a practical application here for serendipity, because honestly, I think this is potentially one of the greatest marketing tools that any of us can have, and it's often overlooked. So I'll share a quick story, and it's a story I tell in my book, The Self-Employed Life, that I clued into the power of this very early on. I was in my early 20s, and I tell the story in the book of a time when I used to set up the circumstances for serendipity. So I actually went to the store. I so-called bought a sport coat because I was too poor to own one. I'd left the tags in it so I could return it afterwards. I made my way into, past a guard gate. Crazy. I got myself into one of the most exclusive golf clubs in the country, and actually asked the woman at the front desk if I could talk to the club manager. And he came out, and I said to him right up front, I'm not here to ask you for anything. I said, I'm a portrait photographer serving a very similar clientele to who you serve. I just love to show you my work so you know I exist. There's no ask here. He begrudgingly allowed me to pull out a couple photographs. He was clearly kind of fed up that I was taking up his time, but polite. I gave my presentation, thanked him, and went on my way. 2 days later, this man called me, and he starts off by saying, young man, I don't know what you're up to, but whatever you're doing, keep doing it. He says, in the 25 years I've managed this golf club, no one has ever asked me if I knew a family portrait photographer until just a moment ago. One of our members came in who's having a reunion at the club and wanted to know if I had a photographer to recommend. And I thought of you. I got the job. I then went on to photograph that family and many other families at this exclusive golf club. And I could say, in some ways, it launched my career. Was it good luck? Was it serendipity? But you know what? I set up those
Mhm.
circumstances. I set up that environment by taking a chance of being open to anything that. My guess, Christian, and I bet you would agree with this, he probably has been asked dozens of times
Mhm.
if he knew a family photographer, but he brushed it off because he didn't. And
Yeah,
now he did.
yeah, yeah.
So that's right. That's the practical application of the power of understanding that you can create your own good luck. What I'm what I'm curious about is how that overlaps with something I talk about pretty often, which is this idea that you can only recognize what you already know. Okay. So if you fundamentally get that concept, you can kind of plant the seed. So is there a part, what's going on with the brain here when it comes to serendipity? That, I mean, can it be serendipity if you don't know what you're looking for? And if we know that, do we need to understand what it is that we're trying to see?
Mhm. Yeah, that's a great question. I also loved your example earlier in terms of how you essentially casted hooks, right? What you did there in the golf club
Yeah.
was essentially you put a hook out there, and nobody ever knows when it happens, but then at some point it might happen. And that's, I think, Jeffrey, maybe just as a short thought on that, also because I felt it was such a beautiful example of how essentially I'm sure a lot of the people who are listening are somehow into, okay, how do I get new clients, or how do I think about, like creating that serendipity in terms of this. And I think this is really the hook strategy. This is really kind of at the core of saying, how do I kind of bring in different interesting themes into conversation, whatever conversation I have, being it with going somewhere and casting it like very consciously, or thinking about what are two or three things at the moment that I'm really curious or interested in, and how can I seed this into every conversation. And someone who does that really good actually is Ollie Barrett, who's an entrepreneur in London. And if you would ask Ollie this dreaded "what do you do" question, right, that puts people into boxes and people are like, oh my God, he wouldn't just say, I'm a technology entrepreneur. He would say, I'm a technology entrepreneur, recently started reading into the philosophy of science, but what I'm really excited about is playing the piano. And so what he's doing here is he's giving you three potential hooks where someone could be like, oh my God, such a coincidence. We just started hosting piano matinees. You should stop by. Oh my God, such a coincidence. My sister's teaching on the philosophy of science. You should come by. The point is that especially when we're kind of client focused, we can just cast a couple of these hooks, and then someone might be, to your point, oh my God, such a coincidence. I ran into someone yesterday who asked me about exactly this. Like, I should put you in touch. People
Yeah.
won't know this if we don't let them know in some way. And I think that's the key.
I
But
love that you're saying that. I just have to stress the importance of that for this audience, right? Because we live in a world where people are always telling us to pick one thing, pick your niche in business, pick your one audience. And I love that you're giving us permission when somebody asks us what we do to blow that up to a variety of hooks. And you're 100% right. I was always back in my photography website days. I learned to include some personal elements in my about page and my bio, such as that I had studied yoga for 13 years. And it wasn't just yoga. I studied Iyengar yoga, which is a really small subset of yoga. What it did is it called forward people that a also studied yoga, or even mind blowing if they happened to know that kind of yoga, because it was such a small subset that it created an instant bond. Like I almost felt like if somebody knew that type of yoga, it would be impossible to not hire me.
mhm, mhm,
Right? Because
yeah,
there was
yeah,
there was an instant connect. So I love that you're giving us permission to actually have serendipity hooks,
mhm, mhm,
how we let people know to see what's in the field. You refer
mhm.
to it as a serendipity field, like what's in the field that can create the connection. But here's maybe a concern, if you will, is that self-employment by nature can sometimes be kind of isolating. Many of us are businesses of one. Many of us are introverts or claim to be. And some of us, under real circumstances, live very remotely. But, here I live in the middle of Miami. There's plenty of people around me, but I probably don't put myself in situations often enough that could allow for serendipity. So, in a practical sense, what are some of the scenarios or situations, or how might we, as businesses of one who aren't surrounded by a lot of people, what might we do to leverage the power of serendipity and create more of those circumstances?
Yeah. I relate a lot to that question. I'm one of these closet introverts who, spikes of extroversion, going to a conference, speaking to people, no problem, and then hiding in the restroom afterwards and saying, "Let me
Mhm.
replenish my energy
Yeah.
and get that back." And it's interesting because I feel we obviously live in a world that's designed for extroverts, right? We live in a world that's designed for people who kind of like want to connect and everything else. But so one of the things that I've always been fascinated by is what are the things that how introverts in this world, or more broadly also extroverts, but how can we leverage extroverts in order to then actually kind of cast a couple of more of these potential hooks? And so to give you three examples, one is really around saying, how do you, when you are an introvert, especially when you go to an event or a dinner party or you name it, I, I'm a big fan of directly speaking with the host at the beginning and getting them excited about an idea, because they are then the person who walks around and is like, "Have you spoken to Jeffrey? He worked on this amazing book about self-employment. Like, you should talk." And then the person comes to you and says, "Hey, Jeffrey, XYZ told me about you." Like, that makes it much easier then, right, to connect, because the other person comes to you with a kind of specific hook that they took and that they liked. So first, I think for people who are running their own business, I found that really useful. I had a insurance company last week, for example, and one of the discussions we had was to say, if you're going to a school where you want to sell an insurance to teachers, you don't have to go to every teacher and like try to convince every teacher. You try to understand who are the 2 or 3 multipliers here. So who are the people go to for advice and so on. So not the people in the hierarchy, but the people who informally have the kind of power, and then kind of go to them and say, hey, let me get you excited about this idea. And then they kind of can do the work because they are anyways much more credible. So the first thing I think is really leveraging extroverts as much as we can. I think the second one is really around how do we, as much as possible, leverage the social capital of others, especially in the virtual world, right? So I assume a lot of people who are watching, like you're very senior, and then some of you might also kind of like just start out, or you might not have networks in particular areas that you want to expand into, or whatever it is. And so there, I'm a big fan of casting public hooks where you go to a virtual event, right? Let's say a Zoom session where you have a Q&A function, right? That kind of like you can put your questions in, and you're always the first one asking the questions. And you would be like, "I'm Jeffrey Saw, just finished a book about XYZ. I was just wondering about this and this, how this is." And what you're doing here, and I'm a big fan of using the following approach here in terms of how to cast a public hook, which is, especially when you're speaking, but also when you're doing it in writing, which is to always make it about the speaker, right? So let's say it's an event at a local university where an amazing speaker speaks, 500 people in the audience, right? And you make it all about the speaker. You're like, "Thank you so very much for this amazing speech." So it's all about the speaker. As someone who just wrote a book about self-employment, I was wondering what you would advise about
Mm.
XYZ. And so
Yeah.
what you're doing here is you're making it about the speaker, but in the middle you put your hook. And what always, always, always happens is, in an audience of 300, 400, 500 people, there's always 3 or 4 people afterwards who contact
Yeah.
you and say, "Oh my God, such a coincidence. I just talked with a publisher who's looking for someone they can publish in that domain. Oh my God,
Yeah.
such a coincidence, I XYZ." And so it's really this idea of, now we leverage the social capital of the institution or the speaker versus the one we have. And so I'm a big fan of thinking about it that way, that there's unlimited potentiality in terms of social capital, in terms of things out there, but we might not see it because it's very latent.
Yeah.
And so it's really kind of going into those spots and doing it. And then the third is really more about how do we do more in every situation to try to connect dots. In every conversation, I'm thinking about, can I make one introduction? Can I have one idea that I contribute to what you just talked about? And by doing this, like what it does with our brain is it so beautifully kind of relates, it starts kind of connecting the dots so much more intuitively. And that comes to your earlier question. If you're how do you make these metaphorical leaps where you connect the dots to other areas? A lot of times there's really kind of training, right, in terms of saying, how do I, when I look at a conversation like this, like, did I meet someone the last days who was somehow working in publishing? Great, let me put you in touch. So it's really kind of
Yeah.
surfacing those kind of dots that we could connect.
Yeah, I think if you embrace the serendipity mindset, you then, to me, it encourages me, and I hope this is exactly the effect it has for listeners. It encourages me to do things out of my comfort zone, or things that I might not. I don't like night networking. I'll be honest. A lot of people don't. But if I believe that there's the possibility of some great serendipity coming from that, whether it's a good business deal, or if I were single, it might be somebody you might meet. that suddenly makes it a little more exciting to go to. And I actually, again, as a result of your book, I was having a conversation with a good friend of mine about my own book and directions that we might be able to take the book. And she randomly thought of somebody. She goes, "Well, try reaching out to this person." And I connected with him through Facebook and said, "So and so suggested maybe we speak." And he wrote back and he said something about, "Well, okay, I'm just not sure exactly what we're going to talk about." And I wrote back and said, "Me neither. I just feel like anytime we get together, something might come of it." So he willingly also had a phone call with me. And it turns out his son has connections to exactly what I'm looking for. Right. So what it took though was a willingness of two individuals literally saying to each other, "We don't even know what we're talking about," but it's believing that something can come of it. And maybe it would have happened anyway, or maybe it's the belief of it. But either way, the outcome is there. And that's where I think there's a real, tangible benefit to this. You mentioned earlier something else. You said it so beautifully. It's something about not giving up on the end of the story too soon. And there's in your book, one of the kind of underlying messages I also got is there's something to being persistent to all of this, to seeing serendipity. And I think this is important for us to talk about as well because entrepreneurs often give up a little before the end of the story. Maybe they try a marketing effort and it doesn't work two times. So like, well, it'll never work. But what happens if they went the extra a few yards? In what way does persistence play a role here in seeing serendipity, or is it just a numbers game? But I mean, my sense is that there's something about persistence here.
Hmm. That's really interesting because I've always found that fascinating in terms of that it can go both ways, right? So in one way, you could say, yes, giving up too early with an idea that's worth going through with, that's a real shame. And there's kind of, as they say, there's a big cemetery with all the ideas that never kind of got to really live, right? And that's probably the biggest cemetery in the world, right? That like all these ideas that could have been there but that didn't come to fruition. And then at the other side, on the other hand, there's probably a lot of ideas that people kind of like follow, but maybe it would be better to discard them early on and kind of like just go to the thing that could really be along the lines of what they would love to do. And so I feel like it's almost the question of what do we want to be perseverant about, right? And as a first step, in terms of like what is it that I really want to put my life to, right? Because as an entrepreneur, I mean, that, Jeffrey, with your work and as an author, and I've when I've been in the trenches as an entrepreneur, this is your identity then, right? This is who you are. And so when you follow an idea, it's the idea, but it's also you're creating your own identity over time and who you are and who you want to be in the world. And so I've been a big fan of really trying to figure out what is that kind of North Star that really gives me meaning, so that actually the perseverance comes mostly from this is worthwhile doing because this is who I want to be in this world. So even if I don't get this immediate deal, it's not that bad because yes, we will, go like live in a smaller flat for now, but actually at least it's something that I feel I want to be in the world. And the reason I'm saying this is I had a beautiful conversation a few days ago about I had two near-death experiences in life, and when you face death, you don't care about a lot of the things we care about, right? You don't care about did you make your last year's kind of balance sheet like exactly the way you needed to be or whatever. You care about meaningful connection. You care about did I live a life that's true to myself? And so there's beautiful, those of you who are interested, when you Google deathbed regrets, when people are on their deathbeds, a nurse essentially asks them, what are your key regrets? And it's always the same stuff, right? I wished I had lived a life truer to my purpose or who I wanted to be. I wished I had like fostered meaningful connection, those kind of things. And I think to me, that's where a lot of the kind of real perseverance comes from, that once we figure out like, what is it that's truly meaningful to us? It doesn't have to be a key passion. It can be a key curiosity. It can be something that gives us meaning, that then it's so much easier to persevere because it's actually worth it beyond that one deal or beyond that one thing. And so as a first step, I'm always a big fan of trying to figure that out and writing that down, and then using that as hooks, for example, also to kind of connect with other people who build a community around us, which I think is the second aspect around perseverance, to have people around us who energetically, most importantly, can carry us. I mean, that's the beautiful thing about co-founders, like that hopefully usually there's a kind of balancing between people and they can lift you up. But I've become a big fan of really looking for the kind of people who have a particular energy versus not, because I think that does a lot. And then third, but absolutely not least, I think there's a lot around this. and Adam Grant and others have been doing amazing work around this idea of how do you, in a way, take perspective, like in the sense to your earlier point, like how do you not stop too early because you believe that the story is already over, and how do you take yourself out of something and thinking, oh my god, this is the end of everything, right? So if you're close to, let's say, bankruptcy, right, it emotionally is like extremely draining. I've been there, and it's kind of this thing of like it is so overwhelming, and then at the same time kind of trying to step out of it and say, okay, what would I recommend now to a friend, like just kind of like in a way like we do with kids, right? When you have a kid, it's super helpful to ask them, well, what would Batman do or Superman or whoever their favorite character is, because it takes them out of the kind of system one, oh my God, life is over, to the, no, like, okay, I would advise my friend actually to try for this one more deal here, do this one more thing, because you worked for 20 years on this. Like, why would you just kind of let it go now? Versus when we're emotionally in it, we might just say, okay, I quit, because it's kind of, it just feels the world is going down. And I think that's kind of the thing that I find personally very useful, the kind of perspective taking, and taking ourselves out of it emotionally as much as we can, which is easier said than done. But
exactly. I have to say the deep thinker in me found myself kind of collapsing a lot of, right or wrong, but collapsing a lot of ideas like, good luck and serendipity and synchronicity and laws of attraction, like some these almost magical forces that I think we have seemed to have tended to give more credence to the spiritual side of life as to why these things happen. And yet the logical mind in me has always been looking for how I can leverage those powers, right? And I'm just kind of curious for you, perhaps even more personally, as someone of very logic mind, a researcher, and embracing serendipity. Like, how do you reason that for yourself? Because, like I said, there's a spiritual side to just believing in the wonders and the magic. And there's our logical side that's trying to either make reason of it or to leverage it. Like, how can I knowing that? And I tell you, the older I get, the more I realize that it's a little bit of both in a way, right? I believe in the wonders of the world and spirituality. And there seems to be deep lessons in there that if I can get a hold of the lesson, that I can actually steer my life in the way that I want. And I'm kind of curious for you personally, certainly for someone younger than me as well, but of logical mind and research base, how do you reason those two entities in your own world?
Yeah, well, that was the great excuse with the book, that in a way, the subtitle literally is the art and science of serendipity, for exactly that reason, that there's an art to it in terms of this kind of beautiful, magical moment that we can hardly capture, and that it can be very intuitive, and that can be very kind of, in a way, hard to capture. And then there's the science of a science-based framework of saying, when you look at all these stories around the world, there's always the same pattern behind it. It's always the kind of unexpected trigger, then someone connects the dots and does something with it, and then we can influence that process. And so then we can study that. And I've always been fascinated, Jeffrey, because a big part of my life, as community builder, as entrepreneur, I always felt like serendipity has been a life force and a daily practice, but I felt it's kind of very individual, like it's very idiosyncratic to me, right? That is, I enjoy it, but hey, can you do it? But then we created a community, of young innovators from different fields, and we put them together. And you would go to a dinner, and people would constantly go, "Oh my God, such a coincidence, such a coincidence, such a coincidence, such a coincidence." And so there was this idea, wow, could we be a serendipity accelerator? And so there was kind of this practical interest around it. But I thought, okay, this is probably not that academic. But when I started my academic work around, how do you scale social impact? How do you scale meaning? Those kind of different questions. Serendipity just popped up everywhere among the most successful, purpose-driven, inspiring people. And as you've seen in your own life, right? Like you as someone who's extremely inspiring in that regard too, you essentially, like, it pops up everywhere. And once it starts popping up, people always, when they narrate it, right? When you ask them about it, they will say, yeah, I worked hard and then I had a bit of luck. Well, or you just really, like, you worked really hard to have more luck. And I think that's kind of something where, yes, there's always this aspect of randomness, but also they got really good at pattern recognition, saying, okay, if this unexpected thing happens, I can do this with it. I can do this and this. And so I've become a big fan of the science around it, and saying, you know what, there's a lot we can learn from physics around how energy travels. There's a lot we can learn from molecular chemistry of how kind of you can accelerate unknown reactions and making it more likely that something comes out of it. So it's those kind of things where the art and science meet. And I think that's the beauty of this journey, as you know, of writing a book, that you in a way have the license to bring that together and say, what I spiritually feel is a life force And the science tells me if I can bring that together, then in a way that feels it makes it a bit more whole.
Yeah, I think you're terming it pattern recognition is exactly it, and really important, because I was also kind of fascinated by the idea. Your book is called Connecting the Dots, but we often connect dots in hindsight. We often there's an event in our life and we connect the dots, and I guess we probably make a choice. We either connect those dots in hindsight to prove the magic of it, like, wow, what are the chances? Or we connect the dots and say, oh yeah, it makes perfect sense then that came to be. So with knowing that, though, I mean, I just have never thought about connecting the dots. I've always thought of connecting the dots as looking back. And in my professional work, I do this a lot as I'm helping people find what's most brandable in them, like what's the business we're building. And I'm always connecting the dots, many that they have shut down between their past. And to me, connecting dots has always been in hindsight, but there is something to the pattern recognition, that connecting the dots doesn't have to be a hindsight. That actually what you're suggesting is there's a way we can connect the dots to create the circumstances forward to have moments of serendipity. Is that, am I getting that right? Is it also based on like pattern recognition? And how do what's the difference between connecting the dots in hindsight versus moving forward?
Yeah, absolutely. And I love that question because I
Kind of an
think
intense question.
no, I love it because I think that's one of the key themes that I've seen with I work a lot with executive teams, and it always breaks my heart. You know how CEOs, they go into the boardroom and they would be like, I planned this, then I did exactly this, and then exactly this happened, right? And everyone sits there and nobody really believes it, but like they want to feel that kind of control that they had at any point and the authority that comes from it. The same when we go with a CV to a new employer, right? We might say, I did this, then I did this, then I did this. Yeah, but maybe you just ran into someone at a conference and then kind of unexpectedly something else happened. And so the point is we tend to airbrush serendipity a lot of times out of our professional stories because we essentially want to show that we had control at any point in time. And then the magic we kind of reserve a little bit for love stories and then when we have like private conversations and things like this. I think that the problem of airbrushing serendipity out of our stories is that it does exactly this. It in a way kind of like pictures serendipity as something that's just passive, even though we just finished a study, for example, with the top CEOs in the world who run big businesses, and we try to understand what is it that differentiates them. And one of the key things they're extremely good at is to say, you know what? I cultivated an environment that makes it more likely that the positively unexpected can happen. And so one of the big shifts in this kind of mindset is to say, rather than seeing the unexpected and serendipity as a threat that in a way kind of like makes us look weak and out of control, we can actually say we created a culture and a mindset that allows us to cultivate this. And then actually that is the real kind of strength, because we're not in this illusion of control. And if we still have time later, we can talk about the potato washing machine as a great example of this. But the piece to your question, though, the connecting the dots at hindsight is a lot about post-rationalizing, somehow making sense, imbuing meaning in things like from where we are now, from the knowledge we have now versus what we had back then. But connecting the dots forward, I think that's where it gets really exciting, because essentially you can create those conditions, to a point, that make it more likely that we can connect the dots meaningfully. So what do I mean with this? So for example, in a company context, the reason why I'm so excited about purpose-driven leadership, for example, is that if we give people a sense of direction, say, if we're MasterCard, we want to get 500 million people into the financial system. And this kind of like those people who were unbanked now can become part of the system. Now I have something I can connect dots to. Now when I speak with a friend over dinner and they tell me about a new startup that does financial inclusion initiatives, I could be like, oh my God, such a coincidence. Like my CEO just told us we should look for financial inclusion stuff. Let me connect that to this thing. It's easier to connect the dots if we know what to connect them to, right? And so that's really the same in our life, why I'm such a big fan of thinking about what are the non-negotiable core values we have or key curiosities. Once we have those, it's easier to select what kind of opportunities do I want to look out for versus which ones not. And so it gives us the kind of definition of our potential serendipity fields a bit easier and makes it easier to connect the dots. And so there's a lot of conditions we can create for individuals, but also, for organizations, everything from project funerals to other things that allow us to do that.
You towards the end of the book, you reference a serendipity scorecard, which I think would be useful if maybe we can touch on this idea that there are questions that we might ask ourselves, because I would love for our listeners to take the time to just ask themselves as to whether they are set up for moments of serendipity. So can you recall, because there are a lot of questions, but can you recall a couple of the couple of the questions that you suggest as a serendipity scorecard, so that, like I said, we might ask ourselves to just find out, are we positioned in a way that we can expect serendipity to even come our way?
Yeah, yeah, that's a great question. I'm trying to find the one that might fit your listeners the best, because I think I'm a big fan. Something that I've realized whenever I listen to kind of management guru type people, they focus a lot on the kind of rational strategizing and everything else, but actually a lot of it is gut feeling, right? A lot of it is when you talk with a CEO after the fourth glass of red wine, they will tell you, you know what, I pretended I had this whole kind of rational like justification for why I made this choice, but actually it just like in the morning I woke up and I felt like, and I just did it, right? And so the point here is that one of the key questions, or one of the key things is, do I trust my gut, right? Like
Mm.
like I trust my gut. And the reason this is such an important question, I think, is that there's a big difference between the kind of naive gut feeling, which is fight or flight, fear based, which kind of a lot of times when we start out in a context, we don't have a pattern recognition yet, so we don't know a lot of patterns, so like we have more the fight or flight, versus the more we learn about patterns, the more we grow into an area, the more actually we have a mature gut feeling, an informed gut feeling. And that's when, once we start trusting that gut, that's when the subconscious knows so much more than what we could learn in a meeting. And I've been a big fan of really thinking about, whenever I have a gut feeling, how do I get as much information as I can to make it as mature as it can, in terms of like understanding what does it try to tell me, and then to trust it, because my worst decisions came from not trusting the gut, right, and just following the
Yeah.
data. And so a lot of the questions are really around these kind of things, in terms of when you think about what are the key aspects for how you can recognize serendipity in the moment, this coffee shop moment, right? You got to trust your gut that that person might be the love of your life. Like, there's no one telling you, oh, let me advise you, I'm a McKinsey consultant, let me advise you that this person might be the person. No, in the moment, you got to trust your gut. And so it's those kind of things where we can train that to learn to trust the gut by a lot of the things that we're talking about. I think there's a lot of other things that are more around curiosity, right? Around this question of, do I ask things like why, right? Do I try to inquire what's behind when someone tells me something? I'm always a big fan of this kind of toothbrush problem, right? Like, imagine you're in a relationship, and your partner tells you to not put the toothbrush somewhere, and then you put it there, and then you have a fight about the toothbrush. Obviously, if you just fight about the toothbrush, you'll never know what it's really about. But if you ask, hey, why is that really disappointing to you? It comes to, oh, I feel disrespected. And you dive deeper into it, and you kind of surface like underlying problems that are there. And that's the same in all areas in business as well, right? If you're the marketing department working with design, and they just tell you, we don't like this design, that's not really helpful. But if you ask why, and you dive a little deeper, you might be like, oh my God, yes, we've been thinking about something similar. Let's connect those dots differently, and
Yeah,
so on.
I think there's a great hope in your book around serendipity. Like, I think for a lot of us self-employed business owners, I think there's just tremendous potential, like you said, in trusting your gut, and in trusting in something bigger than you. Just trusting in the beliefs of serendipity can, I hope what it does is, I hope the trust and the beliefs of serendipity encourages people to put themselves out there in the world in ways that magical things can happen. Be the crazy 23-year-old that walks into an exclusive country golf club and see what happens, But I could tell story after story after story about things like that. And whether we look at it as magic or we look at it as logic, it almost doesn't matter. The benefit is that it can actually change your life. Things can happen. Like I said, there's a tremendous underlying message of hope in your book that I know I have specifically done 2 or 3 things differently, even in the week since I read your book, because I thought, who knows what could happen? And gosh, what a wonderful way to live your life, just thinking, who knows what could happen? And again, I caution everyone about where we're at today in this high level of self-care, protection of our time. Just also ask yourself, with the idea of this serendipity scorecard, just also ask yourself if you're shutting down opportunities by being so protective. Reading your book has opened me up, Christian. So I really appreciate it. And before I let you go, though, we're going to do our rapid round around the acronym of SELF, so we can learn a little bit more about you. The S in self stands for sustainability. What's one daily habit you have that sustains you?
Gratitude for being able to live with the love of my life.
Hmm, beautiful. The E in self stands for elevate. What's one thing you suggest we can do to elevate our business?
To really think about what are hooks that I can cast that are truly meaningful to me, and how do I bring that into every conversation with the aunt, with the uncle, especially with those people we don't expect something to come from.
Awesome. The L in self stands for let's go. What's one action step you would encourage us to take even today?
Ask slightly different questions. Instead of asking the kind of what do you do type questions, ask something like what do you enjoy doing? Something that opens up a little bit more the kind of potential opportunity space within it.
Beautifully said. And the F in self stands for facing a challenge. With all that you've accomplished, what's one challenge you still face?
I think it's really scaling this idea and thinking about, I've seen this work, like it comes out of a lot of research, it kind of works in those areas, but I found it fascinating, when starting to kind of, disseminate the book, I had psychologists reaching out and saying, oh my God, this helps me decrease anxiety in my patients. I had parents reaching out and saying, oh my God, this helps me create meaningful connection with my kids. And so it's those kind of areas of application that unexpectedly, so I wasn't even aware of that might be an option. And
How
so
ironic, right?
exactly.
Yeah.
And so the next years of my life really dedicated on, how do we essentially bring that into education system, organizations, and so on, and really scale that idea.
Ah, fantastic. Well, Christian, let us know, how can we find out more about you and your work, and of course, to get your book?
So the best way probably is the bookstore of your choice. It's called Connect the Dots, The Art and Science of Creating Good Luck. The homepage is theserendipitymindset.com, and I'm at Chris Serendip on Twitter.
Awesome. Well, we'll make sure all those links are available on our show notes at jeffreyshaw.com/podcast for your ease. You can just hop over to the show notes and grab those links as well. And of course, if you're watching us on YouTube, be sure to also sign up and subscribe to the podcast on your podcast app of your choice, The Self-Employed Life. You'll find us there. Christian, thank you so much for being here. Thank you for writing really just truly a wonderful book that has given me hope, as I believe it will for all your readers and our listeners of our conversation today, and likely to just motivate people to take some different action to create these opportunities for serendipity. So thank you for being here.
Thank you so much for having me and for the brilliant questions.
Awesome. Remember, you might be in business for yourself, but you're not in business by yourself. Be your best self, be proud, and keep changing the world.